It began in a vision, not a dream, not a fantasy, but something far more dangerous. Carl Jung was descending, not down a staircase, not into a cave, but into the hidden structure of his own mind. And what he found there did not greet him with reason or logic. It greeted him with symbols, with characters, with a prophet, and a woman. In the Red Book, Jung's inner autobiography of the soul, he documents an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about consciousness, reason, and love. The prophet Elijah, the blind seer, and beside him, Salome, the dark, feminine, the one who dances, tempts, and, perhaps most importantly, sees. This was no intellectual exercise. Jung didn't create these characters. He met them. They spoke to him, and as he later said, I had to accept that what I had previously called my soul was not at all my soul, but a dead system. The encounter with Salome and Elijah was the beginning of a rupture in that system. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must understand what Jung was undergoing. The Red Book was written during what he later described as his confrontation with the unconscious. Following his break with Freud, Jung found himself plunged into a spiritual and psychological crisis. Dreams flooded his mind. Myths, symbols, temples, blood, serpents. He didn't repress them, he followed them, and in following, he descended. One night, during active imagination, a practice of entering dialogue with the unconscious, Jung found himself in an otherworldly house. There, he met Elijah, the prophet from the Old Testament, and Salome, a mythic seductress often blamed for the beheading of John the Baptist. But this was no biblical retelling. Salome was blind, Elijah was calm and paternal, and their relationship was not one of temptation but of mystery, of paradox. Jung didn't understand it at first, but he felt its power, felt that something primal and shattering was unfolding. In the garden, he wrote, it had to become apparent to me that I loved Salome. This single sentence would fracture his identity, because he had not chosen to love her, he had not willed it. The feeling arose from the depths. He writes, this recognition struck me since I had not thought it. That line, so simple, is one of the most important in the history of depth psychology, because it reveals the core of Jung's philosophy, that the unconscious does not merely contain memories or repressed desires, it contains truths that the ego cannot see, and sometimes it confronts us with realities we are not ready to accept. Salome was one of those realities, but what does she represent? To Jung, Salome came to embody the anima, the inner feminine figure that appears in a man's unconscious. She is not just woman, but woman, the soul image, the gateway to emotion, intuition, and spiritual truth. Yet Salome is also blind. Why? Because at this point in Jung's journey, his inner feminine was not integrated. She was raw, untamed, misunderstood. She was powerful, seductive, and overwhelming. To love her was to love the unknown, the irrational, the part of him that Freud had warned against. But Jung couldn't look away. He couldn't return to sterile theories. He was being pulled into myth. And what myth did this mirror? Some see echoes of Faust, others of Sophia, the Gnostic embodiment of divine wisdom. But Jung didn't reduce it to a single story. Instead, he allowed the symbols to remain alive, breathing, contradictory. Salome was love. Salome was danger. Salome was transformation. And she was not alone. Standing beside her was Elijah, the prophet who sees, the father, the wise one. To Jung, Elijah was the personification of logos, order, structure, guidance. He was everything Salome was not, and yet they were together, intertwined. This shocked Jung. In one of the most telling passages, Elijah says to him, "You should recognize her through her love." This was the reversal of everything Jung thought he knew. That logic must dominate emotion. That wisdom must transcend feeling. But here, the prophet says, no, understand her not through fear, but through love. The anima is not to be dissected. She is to be embraced. Salome in turn says she loves the prophet. This is the moment that breaks Jung's mind, because it shatters the boundary between the spiritual and the sensual, the divine and the erotic, the masculine and the feminine. Elijah, the symbol of intellect and prophetic vision, is united with Salome, the symbol of passion and mystery. They are not in opposition. They are one, and Jung is the witness to their union, or perhaps its product. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if Jung is not merely watching these figures? What if they are parts of him? This is where the Red Book becomes more than a psychological experiment. It becomes a spiritual event, a myth unfolding not in history, but in psyche. Elijah is the father of wisdom. Salome is the daughter of desire. Together they give birth to a new consciousness, Jung. But Jung doesn't accept this easily. He resists, questions, doubts. He writes, "What a thinker does not think he believes does not exist, and what one who feels does not feel he believes does not exist." He's wrestling with two truths, thought and feeling, logos and eros, Elijah and Salome. This tension will shape the rest of the Red Book and Jung's life. Because what he's learning is this: the soul is not pure logic. The unconscious is not chaos. It is symbolic, erotic, paradoxical. And until we embrace both Elijah and Salome within us, we remain split, fragmented, blind. What do you do when the most rational part of you meets the most irrational love imaginable? Jung did not walk away from the garden. He stayed. He let the presence of Elijah and Salome unfold like a sacred performance, and he watched not as a scientist, but as a participant. And as he observed their union, something even more unsettling began to arise within him. He started to realize that Salome and Elijah were not external entities. They were inner forces. They were him. This was the initiation into what Jung would later call the transcendent function, the mysterious process by which the psyche attempts to heal its splits by uniting opposites. But unlike logic, which seeks linear clarity, the psyche does this symbolically, mythically. It creates characters, visions, dialogues. It does not argue, it dreams. The appearance of Elijah and Salome was not a message, it was an archetype unfolding. Jung was being invited into what ancient mystics once called konjunktio, the sacred marriage, not of two people, but of two energies, the union of logos and eros, mind and soul, masculine and feminine. This is the same archetypal pattern seen in alchemy, where sulfur, the fiery, passionate principle, and Mercury, the cool, rational one, must be fused. In the Red Book, Jung was living that alchemical process from the inside, but the cost of integration is destruction, because before something new can be born in the soul, the old identity must dissolve, the ego must be cracked open, and for Jung, the figure who did that was not Elijah, it was Salome. She was the disruption, the temptation, the unbearable feminine force that he had long disavowed in favor of intellect and theory. But now, she was unavoidable. She stood before him blind, yet more aware than he had ever been. Jung writes, "You begin to have a presentiment of the whole when you embrace your opposite principle." This was the birth of his most radical idea, that true psychological health is not achieved through dominance of one principle, but through reconciliation of opposites. To become whole, you must make peace with your shadow. To gain wisdom, you must feel. To see, you must love what blinds you. But Jung didn't arrive at this through theory, he arrived at it through agony. The Red Book is not a philosophical text, it's a fever dream, a spiritual wound etched in crimson ink. And nowhere is this wound more raw than in the passages about Salome. Why? Because Salome does not fit into neat categories. She is not simply temptation, nor wisdom, not purely evil, nor purely good. She is the Anima in her raw, unfiltered state. She demands attention, reverence, emotion. And for a man trained in science, raised in a world that divided soul from matter, spirit from flesh, she was overwhelming. She represented the return of the irrational, the feminine, the lunar, the unseen. Jung's Western mind had spent years suppressing this, but the psyche does not forget. It stores what is repressed and returns it in symbols. And Salome was that return. Not just for Jung, but for all of us. Because here lies the deeper truth. Jung's visions are not merely personal. They are universal. They speak in the symbolic language that every human psyche understands, if only we have the courage to listen. Salome is not just a woman in Jung's fantasy. She is the part of you that you fear because it feels too much. She is the longing you suppress to remain rational. She is your intuition, ignored, your tenderness, shamed, your sensuality, repressed. And Elijah, he is the part of you that keeps order, that insists on meaning, that quotes scripture instead of asking questions. He is the wise old man who says, "Stay in the light, even as the darkness knocks on your door." But the truth is, they belong together. And Jung, in that strange vision, was forced to witness the truth of their union. At one point he even says, "I had to accept that my soul was a woman." This wasn't a surrender to fantasy. It was an initiation into psychological reality. Because the psyche is not masculine or feminine. It is both. And until we make peace with the other within, we remain fractured. That was Salome's lesson, and it terrified him. In his later writings, Jung would refine this into his Anima, animus theory, suggesting that every man has a feminine soul image, Anima, and every woman a masculine one, animus. These are not roles. They are archetypal forces, and when ignored, they wreak havoc. But when integrated, they bring creativity, wisdom, and love. But integration is not romance. It's not pretty, it's war. Because the ego resists. It wants control. It fears the unknown. And Salome was the unknown incarnate, a blind woman who sees more than the prophet, a daughter of death who speaks of love, a rejected seductress who returns as a spiritual guide. And perhaps most disturbingly, Jung loves her. He doesn't know why. He doesn't want to. But he does. That's the moment the ego cracks. Because love, true love, is irrational. It does not obey hierarchy. It does not fit into neat theological boxes. It emerges from the soul as recognition. And Jung recognized her. As he wrote, "They were each other's poison and healing." Salome was not a test. She was a mirror. She showed Jung what he had denied, his capacity for passion, his longing for mystery, his deep-rooted desire to feel, not just think. In loving her, Jung entered the next stage of individuation, the symbolic death of the old self, because the old self does not survive love, not real love, not mythic love, and certainly not the love of the archetypal feminine. But what does it really mean to fall in love with an archetype? Jung wasn't enamored with a literal woman. He was witnessing a deeper drama unfolding within his own soul, a psychological play that transcended time and culture, a play where the roles were not assigned by chance, but by necessity. Salome was necessary, because only she could initiate the descent. Jung was now journeying downward into what the ancients called the Catabasis, the descent into the underworld, the stripping of false self, the confrontation with the irrational, and Salome, blind and burning with love, was his guide. In this descent, Jung encountered madness, not just the clinical form, but the existential rupture that occurs when the structures of consciousness dissolve. There is a reason shamans speak of dismemberment, of death before rebirth. Jung was being psychologically dismembered, and every vision, every symbol, every disturbing presence in the Red Book was part of this death. Most of us imagine psychological growth as a straight line, more knowledge, more self-control, more refinement. But Jung discovered that real growth is circular. It loops, it spirals. It returns you to your forgotten beginnings and demands that you relive them with awareness. The psyche does not evolve through logic. It evolves through myth. That's why Salome and Elijah weren't just dream figures. They were mythological intrusions, gods disguised as ghosts, forcing Jung to face the terrifying unity of opposites. Because Elijah and Salome, in Jung's vision, were father and daughter, yet also lovers. This is not a comfortable metaphor. And it wasn't meant to be. It was symbolic of a greater paradox, that the soul is both ancient and innocent, wise and wild, parent and child. This image disturbed Jung, not because it was scandalous, but because it revealed how incompatible human morality is with the unconscious. The psyche doesn't play by our ethical rules. It reveals what is. The incestuous image was not a prescription. It was a confrontation, a mirror showing the uncomfortable closeness between the sacred and the profane, the prophet and the lover, the wisdom we seek and the chaos we suppress. In his journals, Jung writes, The greater the tension between opposites, the greater the potential for the soul. He was beginning to understand that these disturbing visions were not regressions, they were initiations. Initiations into wholeness, and wholeness is not purity, it is totality. It is the ability to hold contradictions within you without collapsing. To say, I am both light and shadow. I am both Elijah and Salome. Few people ever dare to enter this terrain. Most remain content with outer definitions, job titles, roles, beliefs. But Jung was being broken open. And in the rupture, he found the beginning of something new, a self not based on persona, but on integration. This process, individuation, would become the cornerstone of Jungian psychology. But it was not born in theory. It was born in vision, in dialogue, in the dark garden where love and prophecy collided, where a blind woman taught the great psychiatrist to see. And yet, even as Jung began to integrate Salome's presence, the question lingered. Was this real? Was Salome just a projection of his own psyche, or something more? In the mystical traditions, Sufi, Kabbalistic, Hermetic, visions like Jung's are not seen as delusions, but as the soul's way of speaking to itself. In that view, Salome was real, not because she existed in space-time, but because she existed in psyche-time. The soul dreams in symbols, and Salome was a living symbol. She was Jung's anima, yes, but also more than that. She was the divine feminine, making herself known in the only way Jung could receive her, not through the intellect, but through seduction, suffering, and surrender. At one point, Jung writes, I was caught between the prophet and the temptress, and I realized they are one. This realization shattered his previous worldview. It forced him to see that duality, good and evil, male and female, reason and emotion, was not ultimate. It was temporary. The deeper reality is unity. The soul is not split. Only the ego is. The union of Salome and Elijah was not a mistake. It was a map of the soul's integration. Jung's encounter with Salome, then, was not just personal, it was prophetic. It foreshadowed the psychological crisis of modernity, a world addicted to reason, terrified of feeling, a culture that worships logic and fears the irrational. Salome in this context is more than myth. She is a warning. She is the voice that whispers, "You've forgotten something vital." She is the shadow of a civilization that has silenced the feminine for too long, and perhaps that's why Jung was so disturbed. Not because Salome was wrong, but because she was right, and because she would not be ignored. Even decades after the Red Book, Jung continued to wrestle with her. He refined her image, analyzed her influence, built entire theories around her presence. But deep down, he knew. She was not an intellectual puzzle. She was a calling, a call back to the soul, to mystery, to love that cannot be explained. Jung never fully escaped the influence of Salome and Elijah. Long after the Red Book was closed, locked away in a safe for decades, he would return to those figures in dream, in symbol, and in silence. They had branded something into him, not just psychologically, but mythically. They were no longer just characters in a vision. They had become living energies, haunting and guiding the work of a man who had dared to look too deeply. And he did look deeply, into others, into dreams, into mythologies, into madness itself. But never again did he experience such raw intimacy with the unconscious as he did in those early encounters with Salome. Because she wasn't just a shadow, she wasn't just the anima, she was the key. The key to what? To the mystery that all of us try to avoid. That love and fear often have the same face. That wisdom comes cloaked in temptation. That what breaks you might also remake you. Jung's later writings on the Anima are profoundly influenced by his interaction with her. He taught that every man carries within him a feminine soul image, one that shapes his fantasies, his ideals, his madness, and his potential. But this was not academic theory, it was lived experience. He had met her, and she had almost destroyed him. But maybe destruction isn't the worst thing. In fact, Jung came to believe that creative destruction, the disintegration of the false self, is essential to true psychological growth. Without it, we remain prisoners of our projections, worshipping gods we don't understand, demonizing instincts we never dared to integrate. Salome was both god and demon, and that's what made her holy. You see, Jung understood something few modern thinkers are willing to say out loud, that the soul is not nice. It's not clean. It doesn't play fair. It brings you face to face with everything you've buried, not to punish you, but to make you whole. And wholeness is never painless. Carl Jung's encounter with Salome was a rupture in his psyche, but also a revelation, because in loving her, he wasn't just experiencing lust or emotional longing. He was being forced to accept the feminine within himself, the irrational, the intuitive, the erotic, the chaotic, and this was terrifying. Not because he hated it, but because he realized how much he had needed it. In his clinical life, Jung had treated countless patients suffering from neurosis, anxiety, depression, and the more he studied them, the more he realized these weren't just medical problems. They were spiritual symptoms. They were cries from the soul, whispers from Salome. As he put it, the reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories. Jung was finally learning to tell his, through myth, through symbol, through Salome. And in doing so, he unlocked a new language of the psyche, one where images were more important than explanations, one where dreams were maps, where gods walked in human clothing, where the sacred wore the face of the forbidden. But this wasn't just about Jung, it was about all of us, because we all have a Salome, a part of ourselves we've deemed too dangerous, too emotional, too chaotic to face, a voice we've silenced, a dream we've abandoned, and if we do not turn toward it, it turns on us. It becomes neurosis, anxiety, self-sabotage, projection, addiction, rage. This is why Jung's vision matters, not because it was unique, but because it was universal. He was brave enough to descend, brave enough to love the thing that terrified him, brave enough to walk with the prophet and the temptress and admit, they are both me. And this is the spiritual challenge of our time. Not to be perfect, but to be whole. To look at our Salome and not turn away. To hear her say, I love you, and not dismiss her as madness, but to listen, to receive, to let her melt the mask we wear for the world, and reveal the trembling truth beneath, because in that truth is transformation. Jung's later writings, his theories on individuation, archetypes, shadow, and the collective unconscious, they all bloom from this one seed, this one moment, this one terrifying vision in the Red Book, the moment Salome said, I love you. And he didn't run. He wrote, he painted, he descended further, and eventually he emerged, not as a saint, not as a guru, but as a man who had met his soul and survived. Barely. He once said, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. And in this story, we see why. Because the self is not what we expect. It is not a shining ideal. It is not a perfect version of us. It is the union of everything we've cast out, our shadows, our desires, our shame, our love. Salome was Jung's defeat, and his victory. She shattered the man so that the myth could rise. She whispered truths he could not have heard from reason alone. She broke him, but only the parts that weren't real. And in her, he found the feminine divine, not soft and submissive, but wild, fierce, honest. She didn't need to be saved. She needed to be seen. And Carl Jung saw her, and through her, he saw himself.